Am I audible?
Yeah, Anubhav, you're audible here.
Okay.
Yep.
It will be starting in 1 or 2 minutes. Friends.
I'll just say it's really cool to see 150 people hanging around here on a Sunday afternoon. Nice to have you all here.
Saksham, you can start the recording. Prince, whenever you want to connect with speakers, you can contact them on LinkedIn or Twitter. Well, there isn't any WhatsApp group for now, or you can join their Discord servers of their respective GDSEs.
Yeah. I mean, with our thing, we have a separate Discord that is open for everyone, so I can probably throw in the link for that.
Okay, so let's begin. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm Anubhav Madhav, Google DSC lead of IIIT Vadodara, and we welcome you all in today's session, which is getting started with open source in it's presented by Google Developer Student Clubs in association with Hacktoberfest by DigitalOcean. We would like to introduce our very well-known speakers, which is Aditya Oberoi and Harshvardhan Mishra. So over to you, Pranay.
All right. So to introduce our speakers, first we have Aditya Oberoi. Aditya is a DevRel engineer at Appright, an MLH coach, a Gold Microsoft Learn Student Ambassador, a 12-year champion, and a very fellow GDSC lead at Amity University, Noida. The second speaker we have is Harshvardhan Mishra. Harsh is a GSoccer at Metacall, a very well-known software engineer and writer. Along with that, he's also a fellow GDSC lead at SIST. I would request everyone to stay on mute whenever you do have a question, please raise your hand and we'll give you the permission to unmute and ask your questions. So now over to Aditya to begin the session.
Thanks a lot for that, Pranay. I hope I'm audible and visible for everyone.
Yep, audible and visible as well.
Okay, I think I'm having a little. Am I audible? I think you muted if you were mentioning that earlier.
Yes, you're audible. Audible.
I think it seems like I'm having a little trouble with audio now. Just a second, please. It happens from time to time. Yeah, I think it should be okay now. Sorry about that. Hi, everyone. Thanks a lot for hanging around. Um, it was probably my headphones that I was having a little trouble with, but that's something that happens from time to time. Unfortunately, well, it is what it is. Yeah. First of all, huge shout out to Pranay and Anubhav, all the different GDS elites who've come together to organize this fun little event. I am Aditya. I am someone who's been working with communities, so I'm really happy to be here with all of you and share a little more around my experiences with open source. I will say that my fellow speaker here, Harsh, has substantially more experience on that front. I'm probably learning along the way as well, but it's a nice, fun place to talk and share with all of you. I can probably get into the agenda, but before that, I'd love to have Harsh come up, join in, share a little about himself as well, if that's cool.
Sure. I guess I'm audible now.
Sure.
Can anyone please confirm if I'm audible?
Yes, Harsh, you're audible.
Cool. So, hi everyone. My name is Harsh, and thanks Anubhav Pranay for inviting me for this one session. Uh, so, just keeping my introduction a bit short, I'm currently working as a software developer at QuantSight Labs, pretty much working full-time open source. And previously, I was a Google Summer of Code student at Metacall and a Google Season of Docs technical writer at Moja Global. So I like dabbling around with DevOps, web engineering, and some documentation, which I particularly love the most. And really grateful to be here and really looking forward to hear Aditya's opinion about communities and all, because I'm not that active in the DevRel space. I'm more into the development side of things. But I guess that's a really great mix that will be coming out of this session.
Yeah, it's definitely going to be a lot of fun. Um, so yeah, I think probably now that we're all introduced, just a little disclaimer: if any of you see me looking at the side, it's because I have the chat on my second screen. So it just means I want to keep seeing what you all are talking about, and in case we have any queries. So don't worry if you see me looking that way. That's really all it is. Just me trying to figure out and see what's happening, what the buzz is all about among you all. So yeah, now that we're all introduced, we're all at least we've talked a little about our experiences. Let me get into the agenda now. So the topics we have today are going to be focused all about getting started, of course, as the title mentioned as well. We're going to be introducing open source from our perspectives, how we perceive it, how we have been able to go through it. We're going to talk about misconceptions and myths around open source, because let's be honest, we hear so many different things about this space. Chances are a lot of them are factual and a lot aren't. And it's something we learned with experience, having navigated through these waters. So that's what it is. After that, of course, it's necessary to help understand, how do you take that first step? How do you get into the door of open source? So that's going to be one thing we're going to cover. Um, I think a lot of us believe that code is the only way to contribute. We also want to throw light on so many other ways that you can contribute to the open source ecosystem. And last but probably one of the most important, we're going to talk about good practices within open source, how we should ideally work about the space, how we've in our organizations learned about these aspects, and yes, of course, how open source potentially impacts these communities that we work with. So it seems like a lot, but I think it's going to be fun. We're going to have a more of an interactive format, because along with our experiences, we want to hear from you all as well. So make sure that you all stay active in the chat. If you have any queries, you can raise your hand in Zoom. I know that's a feature there. So probably a great idea. And yeah, I think it'll be fun. What do you say, Harsh? Do you think this is going to be fun?
Yeah, it will be definitely fun. I'm potentially more interested about the misconception myths and the contribution streams because I personally have contributed to open source through a lot of different streams like documentation, evangelism, and all of that. So let's get head start into it and let's start exploring the whole thing.
Yep. So First topic here, of course, is introduction to open source. Um, as you know, as we talk about open source, I think the easiest way to explain is, of course, software whose source code is publicly available for change and enhancement. Um, and yes, it's definitely a really important point that open source has been changing the landscape of software development in this current time, and definitely for the better. So that's something we can talk about and explore now. Do you want to start on that, Harsh?
Sure. So let me just take a very simple quiz over here. All that you need to do is to just drop a yes or a no. How many of you are using Python here? Just a very simple question. You can simply use the chat to just drop a yes or a no. Cool, I see that a lot of people are using Python. Let's wait for a few more responses.
That's not.
What about you, Aditya? Do you use Python? I guess you are more into
I've
.NET development and all.
I've dabbled with Python. That's what I leave it at. I've tried it though. I mean, I play around a little on my Raspberry, and I mean, I have worked on hackathon projects with Python, so I guess can say yes.
Cool. So I guess we have a fair amount of responses coming in uh, that they have played around with Python. So let me ask a very interesting question now. How many of you are using Windows here? Again, I see
Ooh.
Aditya is a Microsoft student ambassador. Anubhav, I guess you are also a Microsoft ambassador. So a lot of us might be Windows users here. Again, a lot of Windows user. I guess I'm the only one who is using Linux for God knows what reason. But
You
okay,
never
that's
know. You
quite
might have a
interesting.
few people here in the chat.
Yeah. They will be saying like, by the way, I use Arch Linux. Like there is a whole lot community behind that.
Oh, yeah, Arch is good.
Yeah. So
Yeah, Ubuntu
yes,
and
so
Fedora would be the common ones on that front.
yeah. So one last question from my side. How many of you know the person Mark Hammond? And especially for those people who are using both Python and Windows, Mark Hammond. If you want to do a Google search, you can completely do it. But try to think of a memory where you might have heard this name, Mark Hammond. And I can say for sure that you might have seen this name somewhere or the other, but you might not be simply able to remember it.
Yeah, yeah. I think I'll
Not
probably have
Mark
to have a
Hamill.
look as well.
It is a Mark Hammond. Yeah, not Star Wars, Mark Hammond. Yeah. Let me put the name on the chat so that everyone can directly have a look over the same. So this is quite an interactive exercise whenever people ask what exactly is open source. So some people have heard the name, some people have not heard the name. Some people are saying it's an American actor. But let me exactly reveal who Mark Hammond is. So as you know, Python as a programming language was developed for Linux and Unix-based operating system. It was not originally developed for Windows. So obviously for a lot of the folks who wanted to use Python on the Windows operating system, they simply had a lot of problems. Python was simply not compatible with Windows at all. And this is the reason why Mark Hammond's skills came to play. So Mark Hammond was a Windows developer. He extensively worked with Windows API, and he basically knew the in and outs of the operating system. So when the Python folks face the problem that a lot of the user base who can potentially use Python, they are simply using Windows operating system. They wanted someone who can make Python compatible for Windows. And this is where Mark Hammond's expertise in building Windows applications, Windows API, that came into play. So Mark Hammond basically started working with the Python Software Foundation, and he built the Windows API that has simply made the Python compatible with the Windows operating system. So the reason why most of you might have seen his name somewhere is because when you download the standard Python integrated development learning environment, like the basic stuff so that you can learn and do Python, you will always see that there is a thank you note from PSF, basically the Python Software Foundation, saying that only because of Mark Hammond, we are able to provide you Python on the Windows operating system. So coming on to the main topic, I guess most of you already understand how impactful open source is. So open source, the standard definition, it is the source code that is publicly available. But more than that, it is creating a lot of impact for a lot of the users by bringing them compatible packages, standard software that they can use and dabble around with. So today, almost 97% of the enterprise software is being powered by open source itself. Like if I take the example of React.js, a very popular web library, and most of the small startups or big companies, they're using React.js now. Talk about artificial intelligence, TensorFlow, PyTorch. Talk about mobile application development, Xamarin, Flutter, React Native, and more of that. So I guess this will simply give you a fair understanding of how big the entire open source landscape is. And by simply contributing to such a thing, how much impact you can exactly create. Over to you, Aditya.
I think you added so much. I don't know what else I can add to this, but I definitely agree on so many fronts. And I think probably to add a few examples, if any of you have looked into enterprise products at this point, Java and .NET, Java is under Apache Foundation, I believe. .NET
Hmm.
has its own open source foundation. Those are open source as well at this point of time. So we're actually now in a time where we're all dependent on open source software anyway. Think about it. Git is open source for context. I'm sure you've all heard of Git, if not tried it out yet at this point. Um, we can have examples coming up if you have any favorite technologies that you want to talk about. Um, the company I'm working for, we're open source. That's another thing. Apple's product is fully open source. So yeah, it's definitely a space that impacts a lot, and I think some of the biggest factors there are that because of the high amount of transparency, it is easier to trust
Hmm.
open source software. That's always a factor that comes into play. It is something that we all can contribute to, we all can assist the journeys of. So there are definitely a lot of advantages on that front. And it's not even about whether open source is um, whether it's creating business value or not. It is definitely, but it's also enabling so many people who are just trying to learn and get started, um, build their solution. It's just a really, really positive space of its own. And that's not the most common thing around. It's definitely a very, very special space. Um, okay, I think I see we have a few annotations coming up. It'd be good if we could just, yeah, that would be okay. So yeah, it's definitely a very positive space. It impacts all of our lives. One very special example would be NASA's Mars mission. A lot of the software built on that was open source as well. So it can literally take you to another planet. Okay, which is working on this one. That's the potential impact, that open source has.
So just adding on top of it, like Aditya mentioned one point about transparency. So the basic motive behind transparency is that most of the companies exactly want to see on how this thing works or how this thing is functioning. So let me just take a very quick example of how companies are utilizing open source software to basically develop enterprise application. So just asking a quick question, how many of you have heard about Red Hat? Like anyone, yes or a no?
Just raise your hand.
Yeah, I guess most of you might have heard about Red Hat. So for the folks who have not heard about Red Hat is one of the largest open source software companies. So even the operating system that I'm using right now, it is offered by Red Hat itself. So over the years, Red Hat has been utilizing a lot of open source software to develop enterprise application. But now you might think that, okay, open source simply means that the code is open and we can simply use it for our purpose. Why would we need to pay an enterprise company to basically use an open source software? So the thing that we need to realize is that open source software doesn't exactly mean that it is a free software. It just means that the development model is transparent, it is open to all, and it is accepting contributions from everyone, no matter your background, no matter your expertise. You can contribute to an open source software by creating a fully fledged feature, or you can just contribute to it by fixing a simple typo. Every contribution is appreciated. But we cannot simply equate it with free software. Free software is sort of a political movement. Open source is more of a development model. Like if I take the example of Amplify, for the folks who are not very familiar with Amazon Web Services and serverless part, Amplify is a framework that is very similar to Firebase, through which we can develop serverless applications on web and mobile. So Amplify is pretty much open source. You can check out the standard CLI, the software development kits on GitHub. But is Amplify really free? AWS doesn't think so. You have to basically pay for every instance that you're running on AWS Amplify. So open source is not at all free. It has some sort of hidden charges that might be directly related to the enterprise company that it is tied up with, or maybe it might be directly related to the support. Like taking the example of Red Hat. Red Hat sells the open source software, but it doesn't exactly sell the technical components. What it sells is the support that comes on top of it. So Red Hat has got a lot of components, like some components are open source, some components are closed source. So if you are buying something like, let's say Fedora, Fedora is completely open source operating system. So you can simply use it without any sort of cost or anything like that. But what about the case where you simply run into a problem? How exactly are you going to buy yourself out of it? So at that instance, you have to depend on the community to help someone out. So this is the reason why Red Hat started offering its own enterprise operating system, basically the Red Hat Enterprise Linux. So if you want to get support on it, simply buy our own enterprise operating system. And if you run into any problem, you can simply contact us and get the things done. So this is how open source is basically channeling a lot of the enterprise companies running right now. Red Hat is just one example. We have got other examples as well, like VMware is there, Google is there, Microsoft is there. Most of these companies are using open source components basically to drive the adoption of their own enterprise components. Over to you, Aditya.
Yeah, no, that's definitely an important point to recognize. I think even if we talk about like Microsoft, for example, .NET is open source, Visual Studio is not. Like the VS, if you're looking at their enterprise offerings, if you need extra support, that is a separate paid offering that you might have, right? And that I believe is also necessary. I think a lot of times one thing we all forget is that when we talk about it, at least from a company's perspective that's contributing to open source, that has open source project, they are a company at the end of the day as well. FOSS, of course, amazing side of it, but this isn't necessarily wrong. It's just that we all of these spaces have their own purposes, necessities, use cases, and it's necessary to appreciate that. I think probably as we've moved to this side, it's also a great point to start off with the next slide, which talks about misconceptions, because I think as we talk about companies, that's a place to start, and it's gonna take us into a lot more misconceptions and myths that we come across. I think probably considering we're on this topic, the first point I would want to mention is that open source means there will be no money involved. That is probably the first myth I want to address. Yeah, that's not true. There is money involved. Sometimes a lot. Just for example, one open source product that I'll tell you, Microsoft has something called the Monaco editor. That is what drives VS Code, by the way. Do you think Microsoft doesn't monetize these aspects? Let me give you the first best example that you might know. It is called GitHub Codespaces. That's one way that it's being monetized. If we talk about, well, RHCL was a great example on that front. Forum, for example, Dev2's platform. So what Forum does is, the entire platform available for free to self-host. But if you want a cloud-hosted version with support from the Forum team, you opt into Forum Cloud, which is their own paid service subscription. So yeah, that's the first thing. Open source has money involved. It doesn't mean everything is free. So, and frankly speaking, this money is necessary for these products to sustain, their growth to sustain. It's not gonna happen if there is no sort of money involved. That's an important discussion to have. So that's the first misconception I want to pick up, and I think I'd love Harsh's perspective on this as well.
Sure. So just like the examples that you mentioned, there is also the example of Kubernetes. So for people who are coming from a cloud native background, they might have heard about Kubernetes at all. So Kubernetes as a standalone service, it is very difficult to work with. So what are your alternatives on that? So we have got the Google Kubernetes engine that runs on Google Cloud, and you have to basically pay Google if you want to use it. Red Hat has its own OpenShift, which is basically an enterprise-friendly Kubernetes distribution. If you want to use OpenShift, you have to basically pay Red Hat for the theme. So open source has a lot of different components running together, and it is basically churning out a lot of money. But what about the independent developers? So what we are doing is like we are talking about the big companies, and these big companies might have their own employees and all of that. But let us say that you are an open source developer, you are completely working on open source. So how exactly are you going to make money out of that? So if you're a student, the very first instance, like the very first thing that comes into our mind are the open source programs. So there are various programs running right now that is more of a mentorship program compared to any internship or a full-time job. Like there is Google Summer of Code, there is outreach internships, there is a Linux Foundation mentorship program. Like these mentorship programs provide a very good stipend to the students who are contributing to open source. And it should not be understood like these open source programs are sort of a goal that the students are trying to achieve. It is more like a launch pad to their open source development career. So if you're participating in Google Summer of Code, that doesn't mean it is the end of your open source journey. It simply means that it is the very start of it. Google is providing you some benefits, some funds, so that you can even more contribute to the open source development of that particular project. Apart from this, there is a lot of open source funding going on. So if I talk about my example, I'm working at Quantsat Labs right now. So if you go and check out the description, we are a completely non-profit research division. So obviously that means we might not be making any money because we are simply contributing to open source. But all our funding comes through data science consultancy. We provide services to different clients, which includes Google, DE Shaw, Facebook, and more of that. And we also have got a lot of open source funding coming from different institutes. So right now we've got a funding to improve the accessibility, the documentation, the continuous integration infrastructure for a lot of the PyData projects like SkyPy, NumPy, and all of them. So these are some of the good streams through which you can get a lot of funding for your open source project. And lastly, we have got the GitHub sponsors. So GitHub recently released the sponsor feature through which you can sponsor the other developers who might be working on something. So I guess like this year itself, 13 or maybe like 40 independent developers from India got the GitHub sponsor grant. And that was the best way that GitHub could have paid them for their effort. So some of the contributors are working on ESLint, Webpack. Some of them are working on the Thanos, which is a CNCF project. One of them is Lias Thomas. He's the CEO of Hopscotch. And Hopscotch is an API development ecosystem that has been developed in India itself. So GitHub sponsors is a great way to get independent sponsorship or funding from a lot of influential people who might be ready to pay for the work that you're putting into. So these are some of the ways in which you can make technically a lot of money through open source itself. But this money is simply for your own sustenance because some people look at open source from a greedy perspective. Like we will be participating in these programs and we might be able to get this much amount of stipend. That is good. That is completely okay. But always try to look out for a bigger picture. What exactly do you wish to achieve with open source? And once you start looking at the bigger picture, things will eventually become much easier and far greater from your perspective.
I loved that point where you talked about people looking at it just for the stipend because we have those discussions around cracking these programs.
Yeah.
But anyway, I'll just get to that. I love the point that you shared, especially about your organization. Like for Apprite as well, our entire product is open source, has been from the start. We have VC funding now. We went through a seed round. Eventually, we're gonna like the next step for us is gonna be our own cloud hosted version, which is that's gonna be the revenue generator for us. But that being said, it will still remain available for anyone to self host at any point of time, and we're not going away from those open source routes. So there are different ways, right? And at the end of the day, it is necessary because when we talk about a product like Hopscotch, for example, Leah is absolutely lovely guy. We were having a chat with him because he's been in touch with our team for quite a while now. And just for example, they've got some stuff deployed, I think, on Firebase. It's not going to be free for them. It's not just that, everyone's going to be like, you take access for free just because you're doing a good thing. And we don't care about it. That's not how the world works. These contributions, these monetary contributions, grants help these organizations survive and grow and onboard more people to contribute regularly. It is necessary for them to sustain. So yes, there is a monetary component in open source, and it is very much necessary. And that being said, people do earn from such organizations, and that is in no way wrong. I think Harsh touched
Exactly.
upon a very important point around, you know, around the programs. Yes. So first point that I want to mention, programs like GSOC, LFX, mentorship, Summer of Bitcoin, Outreach, MLS Fellowship, all of these amazing programs. This is not the epitome of open source. There is a world
Mhm.
outside of that. These are just a very small part of it. So when we talk about programs like these, it is necessary to understand that they are validations or milestones. They're not the end goals. You're not at the top of open source if you've gotten into the GSOC program for a certain organization. It means you've built a good start for yourself that someone wants to bring you on to work together for a certain amount of time. And these programs are designed to help organizations get developers they can work with, to help students learn and grow. There, so please, for your own sake, do them if you really want to, not just because you want the tag of having cracked the program. That's not gonna create any value for you. You're gonna go there, you're gonna sit for 3 months. You're either gonna A, embarrass yourself, or B, survive through but hate it. Or C, sure, you might get interested, but that C is a very rare case, not a common one. So chances are it's gonna be the first two. And for your own sake, that's going to be very counterproductive. A, secondly, you're not going to understand open source for what it is. Like when I started off, with such stuff, I'm not someone who's gone on and contributed to every large project. I haven't done that yet. I just started contributing in a few small places, more with projects of that my friends and I we were working on. We tried to scale some of those up, try to get them off, to actually be able to help and impact people, and that's just as valuable because that is tangible impact as well, and that impact on people, that impact on developers, that I feel is a more important aspect of open source. At least I feel that's really a big aspect, because we love open source because it's something we can all contribute to, and it's something we take back from all the time, right? The impact of open source products is definitely immense. And I feel, the moment our priority shifts from the impact to cracking these programs, we do lose a core essence of open source there, for ourselves at least. And I'm definitely not a fan of that idea. And this is exactly what I was talking about. I see a question here in the chat. How can we prepare for GSOC? I don't blame you for that question. But unfortunately, our system is right now designed in a way where it is all about preparing and cracking these. And that's not what open source is about. Ash, I think it'd be good if you could elaborate more on that. I think considering you've been a
Yes.
GSOCer yourself, you'd be a great person to share on that front.
My GSOC experience, like during the application stage, was horrible. So to be very honest, people say that if you are trying to get into Google Summer of Code, you have to contribute to an organization for like 3 months, 6 months, 1 year maybe. I contributed to my organization for only 2 weeks. So the org that I wanted to participate with, it got rejected. And I came to know about the rejection like on 3:30 a.m. in the morning, when I was having a discussion with my org admin. So we got rejected. We had no choice. But then I came to know that I was a member of another community who got selected. So I just contributed there for like 2 weeks. I prepared a proposal, uh, which I think was not very great, from the perspective when I had a look over the other proposals that got selected. But simply because I had the prior experience before, so I showed them all of the experience that I had while contributing to the previous communities, the previous experiences, the previous open source contributions. They came really handy, while applying to some other organization. So just as a note, Google Summer of Code, again, it is not a competitive exam which you need to crack. It is not a competitive exam for which you need to prepare as well. If you're contributing to open source, if you already have some good experience of contributions, you can showcase that just as a proof of concept to show that you can, yes, you can actually work on this project and you can contribute for a long term. The main motive of these programs is to create long-term contributors. So even right now, at my GSOC organization, I'm working on a PHP code. And this project is potentially more like it is harder than my previous GSOC project. So this is like how things go around in open source as well. You will always keep engaging with your community. You will always try to bring out new features, build new stuff, and also help out the other contributors who would like to get started. So if you are trying to get started with open source, do not do it with this perspective of participating in open source program. So always try to learn something first, because without learning, if you're trying to get into open source, the most obvious feeling that you will be having is the fear of missing out. You will see that there are some few folks who are contributing to open source, and you're simply not able to bring yourself up to their level. So in open source, everyone has got different expertise, different experiences, different background. So someone might be quite experienced, someone might be just getting started up. So just embrace the whole learning journey, contribute to that project which you might be using in your personal life as well. Like let us say that you are using some particular library or framework or some particular tool in your day-to-day workflows. So don't try to go for like big orgs. Just try to find out those projects that you're using in your everyday life and start contributing to that. Most of the organizations, most of the projects are scarce when it comes to contributions and the outreach part. So having your contributions in, having that necessary plug in the efforts, that will really go a very long way if you're getting started with open source.
Absolutely. I think we can also have a look at some of the queries here in the chat. So
Yeah.
I see a question: should we focus on competitive coding or real life projects? Yeah, I mean, if we're talking about real life projects, the open source space definitely counts there. So I do want to say, I mean, which one of those do you enjoy more? That's probably the first question. Secondly, what's your purpose on both of those? Why do you want to do them is the second question. There's a lot of questions you should ask yourself about these before you ask someone else. They're actually going to give you more answers than you think. Okay, so that's the first thing. Like, I think we can get to this a little later as well.
Yeah.
I see there's another question by Vivek: on which year of college you started doing open source and which language you choose for open source. You know the fun part about that second question? Any. There's enough projects in enough languages. I'm telling you, there's going to be projects in languages you've never heard of. Honestly. So that's not the worry. That, whether you're working with Python, JavaScript, C# and .NET, whether it's, I can start naming languages and I'm still not going to be able to cover the possibilities there. So yeah, trust me, you're good on that front. Whatever language you choose, there's enough happening out there. As far as which year of college goes, again, any. You don't have to start at that. There's one starting part that we should all follow. There's nothing of that sort. This is another thing that comes here, right? I think it's because of programs, it becomes kind of overhyped. And sometimes when we see examples are doing really well, who've started early, so we think that if we don't start early, we're too late. And that's another very important part of open source. There's no fixed timeline for you to get started. You do it when you want to, when you feel comfortable. You don't have to follow. There's no roadmap there. There really isn't. Like, I mean, you can chat with Harsh. He'll tell you about your experiences. I can tell you about mine. They're gonna be far apart, right? And either way, we're able to at least get some sort of an impact out there in ways that we're comfortable with. So there's no wrong answer there, right? Both are their own individual journeys, and both of those are right in their own way. There's no wrong answer on that. I could say first, that's a good time to start. I could give you fourth year, that's a good time to start as well. because open source goes far beyond when you start. It's really just about how much you want to contribute, at least on a personal front. So you can start whenever you want.
Yeah.
Today's punchline NES. It's a good word. It's honestly a good one. Because it's that's exactly what there is. There is so much freedom for you to work at whatever front you want. Why do you want to limit yourself to a very specific point in time or a very specific level of skill when there's so much you can do at different points? So it's definitely important. And
Uh,
Deepak has a question around
I
how
see
much should
Deepak
we
has a
learn Git
question.
commands to contribute. Um, First of all, please
I guess I will take up this.
don't try to
Yeah, I will
memorize
take
Git
this up.
commands. Yeah, Harsh, I think you were
So
saying something.
basically, yeah, I was saying that I will take this up because I was at a similar stage. So when I started my contribution, you can still go and check out my first PR. It was an insertion sort algorithm that I was contributing to a DSA-based project. So I asked the same question to my senior, and he just said that trust your intuition. So now majority of the people would be asking what exactly something like intuition is. So intuition is basically the understanding of how things work. So the very first thing that you might be doing is a simple git add, git commit, and git push. Later, you will discover that someone made some changes and now you need to pull those changes in your local repository. So you will simply do a git pull as well. So now these concepts start becoming a part of your intuition. And slowly creating new branches, updating those branches, rebasing them, making a lot of changes, going back to previous commit and changing them. You will be eventually doing a lot of Google search. You will be discovering a lot of workflows. And with the time, you will simply have a mental model through which you can get started with all of these things. And trust me, like I have been doing open source since 2019, not a long time. Uh, I was very scared of all of these Linux and Git commands. But now it seems like if someone is waking me up from my sleep, like at say 2 a.m., and they say me like, okay, Hirsch, you need to do these Git commands and you need to get these things done. I can do that in the nick of the time without having to search for anything. So just like we say, you practice a lot, you get to know a lot, and you start doing the things. So just embrace the whole thing, learn some basic commands, and once you discover complex workflows, your brain will start adapting to them. You don't have to learn or memorize any of those things. So just embrace the journey, and everything else would be all right.
And that makes a lot of sense. Definitely. Sorry, I had to hop off for a second. I think Zoom's messing around with the so that's what had happened. Fortunately, I have a second
Aditya, I
pair
guess
around handy.
your audio seems to be a bit hazy.
Yeah, like it's a bit noisy.
So it's crazy.
I think you should put on that headphones again. It was kind of noisy, Aditya.
Sahil has a question. Do we have to add our own projects in proposal? So that completely depends on the organization that you're opting for. Like if I talk about the NumFocus organization, like NumFocus, a lot of the projects are related to PyData community. So Dask, SkyPy, SymPy, NumPy, like these the projects that are supporting the entire Python data science stack. And they will really accept any new projects. What they will really like to have is someone who can create a new feature. Like the whole PyData community is working towards Array API protocol. So that is a new feature coming up. So you can contribute in that perspective. But if you talk about some other orgs, like my org was specifically looking for new features and new projects as well. So I opted for a new project. I worked on a polyglot kernel. Then there are some other orgs that are also looking for new projects. So all that you need to do is to go to every organization's idea list and take a look at what are the exact things that they're looking for. If they're looking for a new project, you have to make a proposal on that perspective. If you are looking to add a new feature or refactor some of the existing code, you have to prepare your proposal on that perspective. And this is exactly how you plan for any of these open source programs. So Google Summer of Code and Outreach are pretty much same. Creating a new feature or creating a new project or refactoring some significant amount of code. Google Season of Docs is all about documentation-based projects. Programs like LFX are more about refactoring some of the essential parts or fixing some bugs and all of those things, or writing some new tests because it is really beneficial for beginners who are just getting started with open source. So they don't really want to put a lot of burden on the new open source developers. So always try to have a look at the projects that are listed on the ideas page and just go ahead with the same.
That definitely
Sahil, I'm
makes
not
a
very
lot
sure
of
about
sense.
Android. Yeah, I guess
Okay,
Aditya can
just
say
to
something
check,
about Android.
am I audible now? Is it better?
Yes, you're audible.
Yeah, yes, sir.
I haven't played around with some of these audio devices in Zoom for a while, and somehow Zoom's given up on me today. I think I have no idea what's up, but yeah, that happens from time to time. Yeah, I think when we talk about all of these different platforms. Sorry, Ash, could you please repeat for a second? I just finally got my audio devices running, so I'd love a little context, just the last 30 seconds if possible.
So I guess we were talking about these stuff like around building projects and particular features for open source projects. So there are some questions about Android, like how can we contribute to Android-based projects? Yeah.
Okay, so Android's of course own system. I think it's called. I'll have to just check the name once, but a lot of that work started off as an open source. Let me just open it up. I'll share with you. Yeah, there's an Android open source project available. I think it's a mirror right now. I mean, as per their org, it says it's a mirror, but I believe there has been quite a little work on this front. So I could probably share that link once. But yeah, there is stuff you can do on that front. I think now it's only a mirror. It used to be you can actually contribute. Let me send in the link here in the chat. But yes, it is possible to contribute to the Android ecosystem. So that's a link you can have a look at. Yes, Android, the core system behind it is open source. AOSP is the name. It's the full form is Android Open Source Project, and you have sent in the link there, so you can have a look at that. Is it necessary to have a thorough knowledge about a language to get started with open source? It's necessary to understand the fundamentals of what you want to be contributing to, is what I'll say on that front. It's good to have some practical experience, at least if you want to contribute as a coder. Because what happens is that when we start working with projects by someone else, to be able to understand and navigate how these projects function do require some sort of background knowledge from what I observed and from my experience as well. It only helps, right? So I won't say you need to be the biggest expert in the world. It's just as much a learning process as anything else. But yes, a background knowledge, a fundamental knowledge at least. Where you've been in a position where you understand how things are functioning in those languages or platforms, and you've built your own stuff with those. So you have an understanding of how these project structures are there, what sort of design patterns are being applied. That's gonna help you a lot. And that being said, you don't need to know everything at the start. You might know some aspects, and some you'll learn along the way, and that's just as good. Because open source isn't just about being the expert. It's about your own personal growth. It's about learning along the way as well. So yeah, you can learn along the way and do well.
Aditya, I guess we can jump to the next slides, because
Okay,
I guess
yeah,
we have
sure.
spent a significant amount of discussion on these.
We've been
Pranay had
a
some
nice amount of
experience
time
with
around
contributing
here.
to Android. Yeah, Pranay had some experience with Android, contributing to that.
Yeah, and I can help you on that front. Okay. Yeah. So the next thing, of course, was getting started as a beginner. I think Harsh, you're the perfect person to talk about this.
So open source is like it is a large landscape, and most of the people simply miss out on open source thinking that, okay, we don't know the exact technology stack, we don't know the exact workflows, so we will not be able to contribute to this project. So it turns out that open source doesn't only accept code-based contributions, it accepts a lot of the other contributions as well. So I'm not very sure, but a lot of people might have heard about karma. So you can just think that karma is a concept, and you simply have a karma counter that signifies like how much amount of good work you have done. So open source pretty much acts on this perspective itself. So when you're a beginner to an open source community, you simply go ahead, you introduce yourself, and now the best thing that you want to do is to put up a really basic contribution to one of that project. So the first thing that most of the people do is start looking for people who can help them out. So every community has got some maintainers, some mentors who exactly help the people out to land their good first contribution. But again, most of the communities are pretty stretched out. There might be only a couple of maintainers working on that, and they simply don't have the bandwidth or the scope of accepting new contributors. And this turns out really nasty during open source programs, where there are a ton of contributors coming up, but there are not enough mentors or the maintainers. So the best thing that you can possibly do from my perspective is to just have a walk around of the project. You don't exactly need to find out a specific bug or a specific issue that you want to contribute to. Just try setting up the project on your local machine. And that will itself reveal most of the issues that you might encounter. So I was contributing to an organization called CC Extractor. So CC Extractor works on a lot of different projects on a lot of different technology stacks. And one of their project was called the poor man recognition. So recognition is an AWS service that allows us for computer vision modeling on the cloud. So they developed an open source version of it, and right now it was open sourced. So I basically forked the project, I cloned it, I tried to run it, but it had a lot of issues. The project was simply not running. And I decided to revert to the maintainer and said, okay, I'm not able to run this particular project. And the maintainer said, yes, we have some issues. And since no one has contributed to this project for the past 1 year, no one exactly discovered these issues. So my first code of contribution to that project was simply fixing and commenting all the lines that were contributing to that error. And that was my first code pull request to that specific project. And that got me started up with the whole project itself, understanding the whole ecosystem and all of that. So as a beginner, first of all, look at the potential things that you can contribute to. So try setting up the project, try navigating across it, try to break something. Like let us say that you're not able to make sense of that code. You might think that this function is not being used anywhere. So let me just try to comment it out and let me try to see if this application entirely works. And this is how you can get started with any open source project as a beginner. So open source has a lot of different components. It has got the standard code base. It has got a test suite. It has got some CI workflows. Try breaking any one of them and you will exactly see how this project works. So spend like 1 or 2 weeks around it and you will already have a very fair idea about how the project exactly works like. So right now I'm maintaining one of the project at Moja Global. It is a community website that we are building using Docusaurus. Very simple to contribute. All that you need to do is npm install and npm start. And people have been really picking the pace while contributing. So they are able to find the issues really quick. They're able to make the pull request really quick. And it is simply because they're following all of the good practices that should be followed while contributing to open source projects. So they're actually navigating across the project. They're actually trying to find out the particular issues. They're reporting them up. They're raising pull requests for that, and they're contributing in their own means. So some people are contributing by code, some by documentation, some by the infrastructure side, some by the accessibility things. So there is a ton of things to do in open source projects, not just the community website, but also the other projects that are looking for contributors. So just have a head start on looking for the projects that are looking for collaborators, and don't just collaborate for the sake of it. Like I myself is a very good example of that. So whenever make a contribution to any project and it gets merged, I sort of get a dopamine hit. I feel sort of an accomplishment on getting my contributions merged. But the real essence comes when you start contributing to that project for a long term, because almost every project is looking for long-term collaborators. So every PR that you make, every contribution that you do, it simply gets you one step ahead of maybe becoming a collaborator, or maybe becoming a maintainer on that specific project. So this is how you can simply get started as a beginner. Over to you, Aditya.
I think in this we also ended up covering a lot of what we were going to talk next around contribution streams. But anyway, I want to add, I think another place to understand how you can get started contributing is by actually having a look at the contributing guide of a project. Like, with AppWrite, just like if I share the link for our guide here, what you'll be able to see is that apart from the practices around how we want to take contributions, we have the entire architecture, the entire tech stack shared, um, the entire file structure, best practices, all of that. And that little guide gives so much context about what can happen. A lot of good projects, bigger projects, you will see a comprehensive guide there as well. And that's always like, it's a must to go through that. It's going to give you a lot of insights around the practices that each of these projects are following. And yeah, I agree on so many fronts of what Harsh was talking about. There are definitely quite a few ways of contributing, and that entire thing, right, where your first project, you found so many issues while setting up, and people hadn't figured that out because it's been a year since people had been contributing to it. That's a very valid scenario for so many organizations and projects, simply because there is a larger necessity for people to contribute than it might seem. When we look at initiatives like let's keep GSOC aside for a second. Let's look at just Hacktoberfest. We have so many people coming together and trying to get started, but how many of us are really continuing after these initiatives, right? Because these have become our goals, and that's where these necessities arise, because initiatives like these are actually made to help out maintainers just as much. They need that support, and it may not just be by adding a new feature. It might just be by being able to work with it, figuring out bugs, helping document it so that someone else can get started, sharing about it in the communities, within your audiences, so that more people can actually get that awareness about this. So there's just so many fronts that we'll probably delve into a little more as we go to the next slide. But yeah, I was actually looking at the queries there is making the code shorter a good way of contributing. I want to say to that, yes and no. Refactoring, sure, great point. It's another thing that's necessary to understand, if whether your changes are actually making an efficiency difference, or if they're following the styles, because some organizations may have certain styles that they follow in the projects, and if you make it shorter but then you totally mess around with the code styling and it doesn't have an efficiency advantage, how do you possibly justify what you've done? That does mess around with a lot of the consistent work that's been happening, and these practices are something I'll delve into a little more as we move forward as well, because these are definitely very important topics to understand. So it depends. In some cases, yes, it's definitely helpful. In some cases, you might just end up messing around with aspects that were actually necessary for code, for that entire project to function. So that's definitely there. And yeah, exactly, Harsh, great point, that if it makes it unreadable or passes the other contributors and maintainers, then that doesn't help. Now that we're already on this topic, let's hop over to the next slide that we have, and that is contribution streams. It's definitely a very important point. And I really want to start off by talking that there are lots of ways to contribute beyond coding as well, because most of my contributions have been beyond coding. So that's definitely why I want to bring that up, because when we talk about contributing, adding features, helping out with code, that's not two, that's just one. Sure, very important. Documentation is another that we all keep in mind, that we all know of. Great. Testing, figuring out issues, another very important aspect. Evangelizing these projects, that's another great way of actually helping the growth of these projects. Helping mentor, maintain, review, another great way. There are so many ways you can actually contribute beyond just adding code. And they're all valuable in their own ways. They're all valuable and they're all enabling this ecosystem to grow. They're all, driving progress here. So when we talk about contributions, please don't limit yourself to just maybe, don't ever think that if you're not coding, you're not a real contributor, because that's something you might have come across and something a lot of us have heard of. And it's not true. You're just as valuable. You're helping out in your own way. Harsh, would you like to add to that? Not sure. Looks like Zoom is messing around for all of us today. Yeah, that happens from time to time. Our own platforms. I mean, we're talking about Zoom. Try Twitter Spaces for a change, and you'll know. It's fun. It's all fun. But yeah, in any case, there are a lot of ways to contribute. My first contributions were documentation edits. I started off with grammatical edits and typos, and as far as code goes, a lot of my stuff has been primarily around my group's projects and that sort of stuff. When I talk about larger organizations, I've worked on some tutorials, written content, that sort of stuff. That's been my way of trying to contribute. That's how I primarily do that, and it helps actually get more people involved and invested. Like I, for example, talk a lot about .NET and Xamarin, and I know people who I've had the fortune of discussing about how they got started through these. So that in itself helps bring more people, right? If I suppose get 5 people in, those 5 get 3 people in, and 2 and 3 and 5 and so on. Think about how many people you could potentially create these projects accessible to with that one little move, right? So those are all very valuable, and don't think that, like, seriously, I think the whole point around if you're contributing code, then only you're a real contributor comes again with this discussion that we have around cracking these programs, because that becomes the epitome of us, of our growth in open source. That if we're able to write code and create features in these projects and get into GSOC and do that, where open source hamara hi hai. That's where it comes from, and that's definitely something that we all need to unlearn and relearn from there on, because there are far more ways to contribute than you can actually imagine. Anyone who's writing a blog about these, sharing their experience, trying to educate someone else about it, you're all contributing to these open source ecosystem. So even if you're not getting a green star on your GitHub, doesn't mean you're not contributing. Open source is far larger than a green block on your commit history. We're having a discussion. Yeah, no, that's all right. I mean, it still enables all of us to sit here and chat along. Chances are we won't have been able to do that otherwise. So sure, I mean, it's creating value in its own way, and it could just be our own devices and not Zoom. So you never know. That happens. We're all used to it by now. I'm looking at some of the queries here. Folks, please keep your queries coming in. That's definitely gonna be great, because we want to be able to interact more and more with you, rather than just us talking and you listening. And okay, yeah, Harshit is gonna be joining back. Network issues, not even a Zoom issue, right? We all have that scenario, electricity cut, so we have to switch over, and if we're not quick enough, we're out of the platform. that happens all the time. It's totally okay. What are the main factor in open source that you have? Pin? I'm not sure what that means. that you have to pin. Again, not sure. Factors in what sense? Sahil, do you want to unmute and chat about it? Let's just have a little chat. I think that's nice to have. Because I'm actually not sure factors on what front. Can we just allow Sahil to come
So
up and speak?
Saksham, just allow Sahil to.
Am I audible?
Yeah.
Thanks for this session, bro. But the whole agenda is like on open source, right? So what is that main factor for open source that you are like to give us for a brief information in one point to contribute in open source? What is that one?
Why
main
should you
factor?
contribute to
Tell
open
us.
source? That factor.
No, not that. No, not that one. But like for in open source, like we have to propose something, right? So what is that main in our proposal? I'm asking for GSOC.
Proposal kind
Who
of
said
thing
you
is
have to
only
just
for
propose
equal
your own
summer of
idea to
code.
get started?
I'm asking for GSOC.
Oh, okay. First thing, GSOC. A much larger umbrella. Secondly, Harsh will be better to talk about that. I haven't done GSOC. Yeah. So, thirdly, we're talking open source. There's a lot more to open source than GSOC. I think that's something we've been iterating on far too many times as well, but it's because it's an important thing to do. In any case, if that's still something that's important, and I'm sure it's a great thing in its own way. What I'm saying doesn't mean to devalue GSOC in any manner. It's an amazing program that is creating a lovely impact. My point is that there is more to open source beyond GSOC, and I think that the moment all we start doing is thinking about that one way to get in, or just that one factor to get into a program, we close ourselves off to so many potential possibilities in this space. But yeah, in any case, once Harsh is able to fix his network, he'll be back and he'll be able to help out on that. In the meantime, I see Rishabh's question. Can I just take up as a hobby and not focus? Yeah, absolutely. You don't have to focus on it as a career. Just do it in your free time if you want to. You don't even have to do it. It's just a good thing to do. So if you want to do it, go ahead and do it. You don't have to force yourself into this. Please, no peer pressure on this front. There's gonna be people who do that, but don't. You just relax and do whatever you want to as much as you want to. You don't need to constrict yourself into a space like this. Yeah, that's definitely there. If there's nothing more to these domains for us than the next job, then that's all it is, right? Like if you think about why do a lot of us don't like DSA practice, it's just because we're thinking about it as something around the job and not actually because it's something that can help software, and which is actually true. Competitive coding becomes our job trick, but that's how we see it. But it's actually just a sport. So the ones who are really doing well in it are people who are doing it because they absolutely love it. So this is it's the same point.
Aditya, I have a question that what if
Yeah.
Aditya, am I audible?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I have a question that what if someone do not focus on data structures and algorithms just to pass on the interviews? So is there any opportunity or kind of opportunity available through open source to get jobs?
Yeah. So okay. So first things first. When you talk about DSA, is it from the context of like late code practice, that sort of thing?
Good point. Kind of that, just to crack the interviews of few major.
Fun thing, when you start working on these projects at this scale, you're gonna come across a lot of data structures. And that's where you realize there's a real world impact to these. I think a lot of us run away from data structures because all we're seeing them is as a testing technique. But data structures and algorithms have a lot of tangible value they create in software. So it's gonna be something that you're gonna have to learn along the way. But that being said, you don't have to do it like you're practicing on lead code, right? Like for example, when I work on .NET projects and I want to work with a database, there's a lovely thing called Entity Framework, which leverages lists for me to work in a much easier manner, right? That's where I'm leveraging this lovely data structure called lists. When we talk about, it's we were working with JSON files, right? That's a data structure of its own. It allows us to communicate over with REST APIs, whether regardless of what language you're working in. Just an example, if you look at your own, if you're on Windows, for example, and you're looking at your directories, you're gonna recognize there's a tree structure there to these. So you're gonna come across data structures in real life in a lot of places. These are just a few examples I have. We're gonna have people with more and more, but that's exactly the thing. There's so much of application of data structures and algorithms in real life because they have a tangible value they create. The only thing that happens is that you have to start looking at them beyond the prospect of a job. And once that starts happening, you're going to start enjoying working with software because it's going to be an essential part of this development process. And yes, as far as careers through open source go, you can do that. Like if I talk about AppWrite, for example, when you apply, I know this because I've had a chat with my team. Of course, I'm not a software dev, so I'm not involved on that front, at least on recruiting. What, barely been 1.5 months, less than that right now. But I do know for a fact, you apply, your college is there, they're gonna discard that. The first thing they will open is your GitHub. They will look at the work you're doing. Whether you and they look at how public your work is as well. So it does become a factor. Sure, you can make careers through open source. That's very much becoming more and more viable today. It's something that we're talking about. So many people, I know a few people who've been doing a lot of freelance work, and when they have to justify the sort of work they're doing, they leverage their open source profiles. That helps a lot because it's a great way of demonstrating what sort of work you're doing. If you want to talk about your projects, for example, if let's take it as if you're going for a web dev role, front end, do you think your DSA knowledge in Java represents how good a front end engineer you're going to be? Or would your portfolio that is publicly accessible do that? Just an example, right? So it's definitely something that helps a lot that you can leverage, and when you need to. Do we have any other queries on this point? At least contribution streams. Yeah. That's a good point. Storage domain companies, you will see a lot more DSA. That's definitely there. If you're working on apps, like I have never touched graphs practically in my life. I didn't need to because there are use cases that will need it. It depends on that, but you're gonna see these use cases as you work on real world projects anyway, because they do have a tangible advantage, on when you're building. So that's definitely there. Okay, considering we're not getting more queries on that, while Harsh comes, I think we can definitely get ahead and talk a little about practices. Yes, everyone can contribute to open source, but it's necessary to understand that we're all there are certain practices that help you set yourself apart, or help you get a more comfortable start working with projects and teams. Because one thing about open source projects, we're not all sitting in the same room while we're working on them. We're all distributed over regions. We're all distributed. So these become our communication platforms just as much. If you look at GitHub, look at the way how people are communicating on this project, the PR discussions or the issue discussions, all of that. It's essential because we have to work in an asynchronous manner, and that's definitely something that comes up. So I do have a few contributor practices that I want to talk about. The first one being, please focus on quality more than quantity. It's better to have one great contribution than 100 honestly just contributions that don't create any value. I think if you search hashtag shitoberfest on Twitter, you're gonna get enough context on what I'm talking about. I probably don't need to add more on that front, but yes, I will say that um, the work that you do can potentially impact the the work, the careers, the lives of so many people all around us. So it is necessary to carry a sense of responsibility with how we contribute. And yeah, please focus on that quality. Get, if you're working on that PR, don't just rush into like getting 10 PRs simultaneously. Focus on one. Make sure that you've followed the right practices um, around your code, of course. Follow the right style guides. It's comfortable to understand. It is efficient. It's better to do that than create a system where you will have more technical debt on that project in the future. So please focus on quality. If you're starting off with a new project, it's always great to review previously merged contributions, because it helps you understand how contributors are going about these practices, how they're discussing. So you learn a lot from that, and it does give a lot of context. So, oh, Harsh is here. Perfect. um, Harsh, we just started talking about contributor practices. I just talked about how it's good to focus on quality more than quantity, and how that's important. And I've just mentioning a little about how it helps to review previously merged contributions. Um, just hop in wherever you wanna. I think it's gonna be great
Yeah,
to
am I audible now?
hear from you. Yes, we can hear you.
Cool. So one point that I would like to add is try to be documentative in your approach. So you will be creating a lot of issues. You will be creating a lot of pull requests. You will be chatting a lot with the maintainers and the mentors. Try to make sure that be documentative in your effort. So let us say that you faced an installation issue. You're not able to install a particular package on your machine, or a particular project. You just don't say that, hey, I'm not able to install this, so please help me up. Instead, you should try to say that, hi, I have been using this particular operating system, or I have been using this particular Python or Ruby version or Node version, whatever package manager you're using, and try to be as descriptive as possible when you're trying to document on what exact problems you're facing. Chances are very high that whatever you're documenting, whatever you're putting forward, it might end up in the official documentation. Like if I take a very good example of my Google Season of Docs project, and majority of my documentation contributions were just chat messages that were shared between me and the maintainer. So we used to talk a lot about the projects. We used to talk a lot about the perspective. And then one day it simply clicked me that most of the information that he shared, they're not present on the official documentation. So let us try to navigate, let us try to put all of this information on our main community website and the Mojo Global Docs. Mojo Global is the name of the organization that I was working with. So always try to be documentative in your efforts and try to make sure that you're communicating in as much description as possible. Don't try to skip details simply because you are assuming the whole thing to be functioning right. So try to be as specific as possible so that it can really help all of the maintainers and the other contributors as well.
Absolutely, great points there. Yeah, so I mentioned earlier about how reviewing previously merged contributions as someone who's just starting over the project helps you understand practices, how folks are communicating, what it's just it'll help you learn the practices that each organization and project leverages. Aside from that, one very important thing: don't just rush and call devs on issues, please. A lot of people, what they do is they get started, and in the excitement you'll find 5 different issues or 10 different issues, and they'll be like, I want this, please assign it to me, please assign it to me, please assign it to me. Don't do that. It is, of course, you're trying to, you'll end up overloading yourself. Secondly, it's also disrespectful to other people who want to contribute. Oh,
Exactly.
the best part about the open source system is there's always someone you can learn from. There's always someone who's done a little more. There's always someone whose experience you can take back from. Sometimes that patience helps a lot. And as I said earlier, you want to focus more on that quality, right? If you're picking up 20 different things simultaneously, how will that ever be possible? Because you're never going to have a fixed focus, right? You're gonna be so divided on the different things that you've just picked up that it's just difficult to prioritize. And that's a fact. It becomes a problem there. So yeah, please don't start calling dibs on these. It's not a good thing to do. It also creates trouble for maintainers, right? Because it's just that it gets overwhelming on that front as well, and it's not great as a practice on general. Another thing around this front, I think there are times when we see there are issues that have been assigned, but we don't see too much progress on them at that instant. So we kind of rush into them and they're like, nothing's happening. I want this. It's always good to be patient in that because most of us are contributing to open source aside from our individual lives. We have our work, our careers, our families, our stuff at home, all of that. And then there is open source for most of the ecosystem. So the moment you're like, no, I'm gonna rush into this and I'm like, I don't care, I want this. It creates a system of disrespect again. It discards the fact that people might actually have other things that they need to prioritize on in life, and patience is a virtue on that front. It's necessary to recognize that we're all humans after all. So having that respect and patience goes a very long way. And sure, if after a while it's not something that's still getting that progress, you can then respectfully ask, if that person cannot take on this at this point of time, then that way you can respectfully enter that scenario, right? But you don't need to rush on it and just be like, no, I want this resign. That's not a very positive thing, to be honest. I think this one Harsh talked about, but be as communicative about your progress with maintainers. There's so much you can take back from that, but aside from that, because we're not working next to each other in the same rooms, it's necessary to be communicative on those platforms. Those are sometimes the only way we can communicate with each other, and that way we're all in sync with where our progress is, what growth or progress, successes or wins we're getting, what problems we're facing. And of course, if there's a scenario where we can't work, it's necessary to communicate that as well. There's no shame in that, but it's necessary to be open about these things, because we all have to recognize that whatever we do is for the benefit of all those who are leveraging these projects. That's really the impact of the work we're doing. So that does create, of course, a sense of power, but also carries a sense of responsibility, which is very necessary to recognize.
Exactly.
So that's definitely there. Yeah, Harsh.
Yes, so I guess a lot of the good practices that we have discussed are from a contributor's perspective,
Yeah.
but I'm pretty sure that most of you who would be starting with open source or who are already are doing quite great with open source, you might soon end up becoming a maintainer of a personal project maybe, or maintainer of some open source project. So I have been maintaining almost half a dozen open source projects now, and some of these projects are pretty big. So I would like to share some of the points that I have when it comes to good practices from the maintainers. So as a maintainer, always try to be as empathetic and kind to the contributors as possible. Like that is the best step that I can possibly give you. The main reason behind this is like a lot of the practices, a lot of the nature that we carry over being a contributor to a maintainer, it can sometimes get messy. We all have some hidden biases. We all have some hidden perspective about things, that it should be done like this and it should not be done like this. So always try to be as empathetic to the contributors as possible. Just try to think of that time when you were starting up. You might have been mentored by someone in a similar tone, or you might have just had to navigate across the whole community, the whole project by your own self. So try to provide a better path for the other contributors to get started. So I remember when I joined one of the communities that I'm working with right now, it took me like nearly 2 months to make my first pull request, and it got merged. And it took me almost 4 months to become a community member of the same. So the contribution bar was quite high, And the first goal that I had in mind once I became a maintainer was to basically bring down this contribution bar. People can make the PRs really quick, they can get it merged, they know what to work on next, and they have a clearly defined path within the community. So we don't just want like people putting up PRs and just simply leaving out. We want them to stick with the community for a long-term perspective. So we worked around a lot of things to basically streamline this whole process. We became more active. We started our own working group. We had almost bi-weekly meetings where we started discussing with the contributors about what are the things they're working on. We even had some pair programming sessions. So if some contributor is facing issues with putting out their PR, I used to have a pair programming where I used to guide them at each and every step on how they can get started with the same. So being empathetic and being kind is the first and the foremost virtue that you should be having as a maintainer. Second, always look at things from a
Sorry,
broad
just to
perspective.
pause you on that. I would just
Yeah.
want to add that it also goes for contributors. Being a maintainer
Yeah.
is more often than not a thankless job that people are doing again along with their daily lives. Sometimes it does get
Mhm.
overwhelming because, like, just for context, I've been looking at our Hacktoberfest stuff, and we
Mhm.
I've lost track of how my GitHub notifications go because I watch our projects and I legitimately have 1,000 plus notifications in the last 2 weeks. So it's often thankless. It's
Yeah.
often that something people are doing beside that, and it's good to be respectful on that front. Sometimes it's not possible to immediately review your work, and there are people. I I recently had that sort of a thing happening where someone was like, I don't know what you all do. I've sent this and just this point, like this little time back, and you aren't having to look at my PR, and you're just ignoring it, and someone else has been reviewed, and then all of that. And at that point, all you can say is, that you understand that scenario, you try to get across, you try to get through at that point as soon as you can. But think about it, being someone who's working full time in open source can face that sort of scenario. So think about how many projects we have with maintainers who have stuff outside of their, who are doing this outside of the rest of their lives, and it unfortunately becomes a big problem. So please be respectful and patient with maintainers. They're trying to do the best that they can, at least to help the project and to help you.
Exactly. I agree with everything Aditya mentioned. And also from a maintainer's perspective, like the time is possibly the most scarce resource. So I guess like there is a very popular blog post by Ralph Commerce. So Ralph is a maintainer of NumPy and SkyPy, and he's also my mentor. So his blog about cost of an open source contribution is one of the best things that you can learn from the perspective of a maintainer. So he just mentions that since every change has to be reviewed, every change generates notification, and every change causes code churn, it simply becomes quite massive for the maintainers to identify what is good for the project and what is not good for the project. So always, like from a contributor's perspective as well, try to be empathetic with the maintainers. I remember I was maintaining one of the projects at Girl Scouts Summer of Code. It is like one of the most popular community-based open source programs in India, and we had like almost hundreds of PRs flowing in every day. So keeping up pace with that was really difficult, and even bad when we were simply blamed just because someone's contribution was not merged or someone did not follow the correct steps. So if you're facing any doubts, if you're facing any issues, try to make sure that you're reaching out to the maintainer or the mentor, but don't just indulge into profanity because that will simply not end good with the maintainer or the contributor either.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think one more point is that it's necessary to both give and accept feedback very constructively in open source. I think it's a learning process for all of us. So chances are, as I mentioned earlier, one of the best parts is that there's someone else you can learn from, someone with a little more experience, who's been around, who's been contributing for a while, and it does help to listen, to try to understand, because it provides you a different perspective on the work you have, right? You're only going to learn from that. It's we're all trying to make the projects better, but we're trying to contribute to the ecosystem, and a part of that is helping each other. So it's necessary to be constructive and accepting as well as giving feedback, because just as someone else gives you feedback that you learn from, chances are a little while down the line, you would be in that position where you're helping someone else's growth. So those feedback loops are very important on that front, and it's necessary to be constructive there as much as possible.
Exactly. I guess we have covered all of these points, so
I think there's
maybe we can have
one
a
point, I guess. I mean, I've talked
yeah.
about learning, that's there, but there's one thing I definitely want to mention. Be as humble as you can, please. Humility. Honestly, a lot of the points that I've talked about, be it around, the communication, be it around patience, it all comes down to us being humble about the fact that we are essentially parts of a system, and we're not larger than the system itself. Um, it's all simple single contributions that we make, that bring these ecosystems together. That is a humbling fact in its own, and humility does help in so many places, whether it's around accepting feedback constructively, whether it's around learning from folks around us. It does enable growth for us. So please be humble through these spaces. It's only going to help you. I guess, Harsh, that kind of brings us to the Q&A.
Yes.
So I guess I
So
can stop screen
please,
share now.
yeah. So please ask any questions, no matter how silly or stupid it is.
No
Just
question
ask
is
to
silly or
us, and
stupid.
we will.
Yeah.
Yes. I should have remembered it, but yeah.
That's
Please put
okay.
all your questions on the chat.
Okay, I think I got a DM. Samir, you should send this question on the chat for everyone to ask. But yeah, the question was how to find right projects and repos on GitHub or contributing in open source. I want to ask for the very first time, what do you mean by a right project? Right for you, right for the world, right because they're trying to do something positive. What does right mean? Because honestly, it could be all of those. We get to decide what is right for us. That's such an important part, because it's okay. Samir, I think you're still DMing. I think it's good if you keep up information, because this is a question that could help so many people, right? And if it's as far as related to your skills, you can just use topics on GitHub to find projects active on that front. That's the easiest way to find them.
Yeah. And as I mentioned before, one of the best ways to find the projects that to contribute to, just look at the technologies that you're using in your project. As simple as that. So if you're building, like, let's say something related to web, or maybe something related to the backend development, and you find a particular tool that you're really working around with, like I see that a lot of people use Postman for API development. I don't know how many people know this, but Postman has a really vibrant open source API ecosystem. There is async API, there are other stuff going
Yes.
on here and there. So you can contribute to them, as simple as that. So the main problem with trying to contribute to large projects that you simply don't have any idea with is because you never have a semblance with that particular project. Let us say that you don't know anything about containers or cloud native or these orchestration technologies, but you are trying to contribute to something like Kubernetes. You will never understand the basic part at the first place. So you will never have a semblance with that technology. And that will end up you doing some basic contributions, but you will never end up deep into the whole philosophical aspect of why this project exists in the first place. So before starting with anything, just ask why. Chances are high that by contributing to a very simple library that might not have even 10 stars on GitHub, you will end up creating more value than trying to contribute to a large project, which is simply oversaturated with contributors coming from across the globe. So identify your priorities and just try to contribute to what can exactly make you create more impact. That is what I would say. So come on, folks, you can put up more questions if you want. Kalash has a question: how to approach the maintainer for the first time? So Very interesting question. And it is very simple. Just drop them a hi. So you can just drop them a hi, but never drop a hi or never ask just to ask. Always try to share the context. So if you are dropping a hi or if you're dropping a hello, just a greeting note, always try to document on why exactly you're reaching out to them at the first place. So is it a bug that you're facing problems with, or you're not able to simply set up the project on your local machine? Or is it something else, or whether you want to work on a new feature or work with some particular working group? Try to be as specific as possible so that you can get the best answer out of them. So there are very popular articles going around the net that you should never try to initiate a particular conversation with just a simple hi. Try to be specific, try to document each and everything possible so that the maintainers can help you in the really easiest way. So maintainers are no alien folks, like they are pretty friendly for most of the beginner contributors, unless and until they're burnt out. If the maintainers are burnt out, chances are very high that you will face the brunt if you try to initiate any conversation with them. But in rest of the cases, they are pretty chilled up. So try to initiate a conversation in the most simplest way possible so that you can get the thing that you're working on done in a pretty easy manner. Samir has a question. Should we contribute to those projects whose tech are not known to us? And through that project, we will learn that tech and contribute to that project. Is it a good way to learn new tech or not? I guess it is a great way to learn that technology. But again, it completely depends if that technology is actually being used in any of your personal stuff or not. So if you're trying to learn Golang, like I personally learned Golang by contributing to an enterprise-based software. It was not open source, but it was a good way for me to learn up to some basic stuff. Uh, so if you're trying to contribute to a project to learn some of the basic stuff, please feel free to, but at least have the understanding of some of the most basic stuff. Like if you're completely new to a language, you might not know the basic style guides of that language, or the linters, the workflows, the package managers. So have the basic understanding of them so that you don't make some of the most simplest mistakes. Because once you do that, the maintainer might try to dissuade you from contributing. I have seen this happen a lot of times. Like in the Julia community, I once saw a PR where the person made an obvious mistake with the package manager, and the maintainer simply shut him down because he was not ready to take up a contribution from someone who doesn't exactly know Julia. So these things happen. So if you already have some basic understanding, please feel free to contribute so that you learn some more intermittent stuff. But have the basic understanding at the least. This is what I would say. Aditya, I guess you would like to take this up as well.
Yeah. Um, I was just hearing about that experience. I think unfortunately it's a scenario that happens. Um, but yeah, sorry, I just reconnected. I was hearing about the Julia example. It's just unfortunate to hear that because I know that their current community manager, he's definitely someone who who has been a positive presence around. But yeah, that's a scenario
that was much before him. That was much before him.
We do have scenarios where unfortunately people come in with a sense of elitism around these, and that's exactly why I wanted to emphasize on why humility is important. It helps us collaborate better, it helps us communicate better. There's always something that we all bring to the table, and it enables us to accept that we have something to get back from another person. That goes a long way.
Exactly.
I think I probably, because of my disconnection, I lost the previous chat as well. But I see a question around open source licenses here. Is there any question before that as well?
No, there is a question, but we have covered it right now.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Okay, so as far as licenses go, we have a variety of licenses available. Each of these enable certain rights for each project. These are dependent on the project maintainers. One thing I want to mention here, and I think this is something that a lot of people come across about, that not a fan of. I think there are some licenses which are a little restrictive at times, at least in terms of attributions and all. And I think if that's something a project needs, that's all right. The reason for that is when we come up with these projects, we have certain aims, certain intentions. These licenses help us ensure both that people can access these, but at the same time they also protect the rights of these projects in case problems come up. So yeah, there are some licenses which are very open, like the MIT license, for example. At the same time, another license, like some are a little more restrictive, and that's okay. If it's what the project needs, it's what the project needs. That being said, proprietary licenses are very different because the moment you add the word proprietary, first of all, we've moved away from open source. So these are closed source software anyway. These define terms of use, of course. These define, well, terms of how you can use as well, what sort of attribution you can have, all of that. So the moment you mention proprietary licenses, that's a different factor altogether, and that is okay in its own place. That's very necessary. These are legal agreements that protect both you as well as the person using. The only thing I really don't like is projects that have no license. Just another misconception people have. If a project does not have a license, it does not mean it's open for anyone to do anything. It means it's closed for everyone. You can see it, you can't do anything about it. You cannot use it, you cannot contribute to it, you cannot leverage it. So if you see a license missing, it doesn't mean you can just do any random thing in the world with that project. It means you can absolutely do nothing with it, which effectively takes it away from open source. Because all it is the source is visible, but you can do nothing about it.
Yeah, I guess one of the most popular example that we can cite for this would be Elasticsearch versus AWS. So Elasticsearch, obviously open source product, one of the best open source products to come out of the whole open source ecosystem. And Amazon Web Services simply started forking Elasticsearch. Like there is even a public code where it is shown that they are forking that public project. And Elasticsearch had to simply shift to the server-side public license. And that essentially restricted the open source nature of Elasticsearch. So MongoDB had done the same thing before because AWS started creating its own versions of MongoDB, basically the document database model and all of that. So basically the Elasticsearch, like its license is essentially saying open, but not open. Like this is the best word I can use to describe it. So open source licensing is one of the most crucial criteria when it comes to identifying violations. So always be mindful of the licenses that you put on your project. There are some pretty good services, like there is one service called, there is one particular organization called Fossology. So Fossology works on open source licensing factor. So if you are thinking to make an open source project public, like if you're thinking to make your project public, like bringing it out in the open source, make sure that you're running these sort of checks so that you can easily identify if you're using some sort of a restrictive license code base, because after that, it would simply turn in a very nasty mode. So always be mindful of these licensing requirements, because if you're violating that, chances are very high that your project might be taken down or someone else might file a lawsuit against you. And it has happened a lot of times in the past.
Yeah.
Ooh, so we don't see any questions now.
I think I remember back at one of my projects which we were trying to scale, we were working on earlier, which was called Code Capture. We used one of the Creative Commons licenses, which was non-commercial and non-derivative. And it was necessary for us because we were already facing troubles with people around, who were talking about, I legitimately had someone come up with me, can I copy your project and leverage it in some competition and all? And can I just take it away and use your code base and do that? And my freak out happened because someone actually tried to pull that off. So fortunately, we kind of caught it before, but that's when we put up a tight license around that. And what that license essentially said was you can copy and redistribute in any medium. The only thing is if you're leveraging it somewhere, you need to attribute to it as long as you're attributed. Secondly, you can't use it for any commercial purpose because that wasn't something which we wanted at that point. And third, no derivatives, which means you cannot just remix, transform, and change it on your own. You know, and then just take it off that it's my thing. That helped protect our project for us. Because at that point we were working on it, we had separate plans for it. So if you're in a position where you've already seen that someone might try to do this, that can get scary.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's necessary to have these licenses in place, because you might have different necessities you need to work on, and it's all right to have a title license if that's what fulfills your requirements. Some projects, sure, keep an open license. Like with Code Capture, so our web platform that we were working on had this title license. The Xamarin app that I worked on has the MIT license. So you can do whatever you want with it, because I'm okay with anyone doing that. So that's also there. You can have that scenario, and it's totally okay.
I guess we are just 10 minutes left for the session to wrap up.
Yeah,
so
we've been hanging around for a while now. I was just looking at Elastic. They've done some fantastic work around, to be honest.
Yeah.
Yes, Sahil, please. This is the time to ask questions. You don't need to worry about whether you can or not. Just go ahead and ask.
Sorry for this. It's quite off course question. It's like we all know there is one kind of myth, like for getting a good placement there needs such kind of certification. Like I want to do Android, so I need certification for Android and all the stuff. Is that a good one to have certification, or better way to have good side projects in it?
Projects anytime, any day. Let me tell you something about certifications. There are some certifications that do add value in certain contexts. So suppose you were someone who's heavily focusing on an IT field. I've had these conversations with folks around cybersecurity because I was involved with CompTIA a while back. And sure, some roles have that requirement, because some certifications, whether it's the CEH, which is Certified Ethical Hacker, whether it is the OSCP, which is Offensive Security Certified Professional, some of CompTIAs, they need certain amount of practical knowledge for you to actually go through and clear these at all. So they do become industry standards in certain places. Some jobs, they're not going to enforce your college degree. They're going to force one of these certifications. There are chances. But then that's some domains. Now, when it comes to very dev-focused domains, like Android, for example, do you think your certification validates your experience? To me, does that say that you can build an application, or your actual app that you've built and you've shown the source code? What does that show? That you can build an application? Which one of those two do you think works better?
That's good to build an application than a certificate.
Exactly.
Thanks for the.
Did your college ask about this? Because I haven't seen colleges force Android certifications. I've seen them, push on. I mean, my college pushes on AWS stuff because they've partnered with AWS. Like one of our, we had an elective 6M and on the cloud elective that was all on AWS's platform because they have that MOU separately. Is your college pushing on this sort of thing?
Our college didn't push us, but the students, like the colleagues, like Sahil, to have a good placement, we need some certifications, like something kind of such myth we have.
I can tell why they push on that. It's because in a lot of colleges, you see a lot of people are still thinking in a rather archaic manner. What happens is that there was a time, of course, that when so many of us still have the thing that if we have certain academically strong components in our resumes, that's going to secure you forever. And in some contexts, yes, but that that is an older way. We are now moving towards a world that does value your work product. In more instances, you'll find it valuing that a little more than less. So
Exactly.
that's probably my take on it, because sure, some domains, yes, it could help. Sometimes it's, it might be that one differentiating factor for you as well. Like I know for a fact that there are some roles at orgs that come in with a minimum requirement because they need certain knowledge levels. I've seen this more around cloud related stuff and all. Like my college really encourages and pushes on cloud stuff and cloud certifications around AWS particularly, because there are some roles that they can share which need that. So that becomes a thing that in certain contexts, yes, it will help in a lot, in some, and in fact in a lot it won't. There are other ways that you can add value and demonstrate your proficiency in certain technologies.
I guess we are almost at the end. We don't have any questions left. So it was a great session. It was great interacting with all of you.
That's
I
fine.
personally got to know a lot, uh, especially from a wider perspective. So thanks, Aditya, for sharing all these points.
Likewise, I think I definitely it's a very different perspective that you carry, because I think our journeys in open source have been different. So I love this fact where we're able to bring different perspectives together and learn from all of those. It helps a lot. So huge
Yeah.
shout out to you for all that you've been doing and for joining in here.
Likewise. I guess we can hand it over to Anubhav and Pranay
Yeah,
to wind up the final thing.
thank you so much, Harsh and Aditya, for being with us. And I think everyone is clear with their doubts or questions. So we can wrap up the event and see you soon again, Aditya and Harsh. Thanks a lot for being
I
here.
think
And
probably the
thanks to
last
all
thing
of
we
the
can do is
GDC.
just maybe throw in our socials in case anyone wants to reach out.
Yeah, sure. Like everyone can provide the platform to their GDC links too.
Yep.
Like once you will join us, you'll get to know about other events too.
Yeah, that's definitely there. I'll just throw in our Discord.
Shall I share your
That's a fun
LinkedIn?
place.
Great. Aditya and Harsh, shall I share your LinkedIn profile too?
Yeah, please. It is very difficult to type on mobile because I have joined through my mobile because my internet connection has simply gone off.
Oh yeah, that's such a difficult scenario, honestly, and it happens so often, unfortunately.
Mhm.
Yeah, I've thrown in my Twitter and LinkedIn. Um, if anyone wants to reach out, those are good places. Sometimes it takes a little extra time because there's a lot of messages, but we eventually get to those. So yeah, that'll happen.
Pranay, will you like to say anything?
Yeah, all right. Thank you for coming, everyone. As we all know, Hacktoberfest is going on, so let's contribute quality and not quantity to open source, as Aditya mentioned before. And a big shout out to both of our speakers, Harsh and Aditya, for joining us today and giving us such an intuitive and interactive talk altogether on open source and its benefits. Thank you, everyone, for joining in there.
Thank you everyone for joining.
Thanks a lot for having
We can-
us.
Welcome. Okay, so
Have a great Happy Day Fest,
Sachin, we
everyone.
can stop the recording, and Anurag, we can stop live streaming too. Thank you.
Right then. I guess we can all hop off and enjoy the rest of our Sunday.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
That's needed.
Right then. See you all. Have a great day.
Okay,
Bye,
Bye.
everyone.
like, okay, let's have a
Bye, everyone.
screenshot for all the GDC leads who have organized this.
Oh,
A
sure.
picture. So can you please all turn on your cameras, all the GDC leads who have organized this and the organization team?
Here we have Harsh's camera.
Aman, Janmay, Anurag. Anurag, you can join us. Well, everyone can turn on your cameras, even if you're a attendee.
Actually, everyone can do that.
open source. Okay. So just waiting for 10 to 15 seconds more. Is everyone here?
Oh,
Stop
I think the
host
host
has
said
stopped the
camera
camera.
access isn't there
Okay,
for all.
Sachin, can you please allow each and everyone to turn on the cameras?
Yeah, just give me a second. Just give me a
Yeah,
second.
sure.
Yeah, so now everyone can turn on their videos.
Anurag, Ishan is here. Pushkar, Rustam, Ricky, Devarshi, most welcome.
Yeah, everyone wants to turn on their cams. Please feel free to do so.
Wait for more. I think we are done with it. Okay. So I'll share the screenshot soon, or you can find it on our social media handles too. Thank you, everyone.
Sure.
Thank you, everyone,
Right.
and all the GDSC leads as well for organizing these events, for collaboration, and thank you, Envo, for taking initiative.
Have a great weekend, everyone. Bye.
Bye.
Bye, Ariam.
Finally, प्रणय हो गया.
हो गया अच्छे से हो गया.
काफी अच्छा सेशन गया. मजा आ गया.
भाई